I think we'll get going here. Start by saying thank you to everybody who has taken the time to log on for this webinar and participate in it. We really appreciate that. I want to say happy World Biodiversity Day to everyone. We intentionally chose this day as the opportunity to do this Biodiversity Offsets 101 because it lines up with that. I just want to start very quickly before I even do the introductions with a couple of tech notes. Everybody who is participating, you're all muted by default, so don't worry about that part of it. The panelists will be coming up by video at different points through the session, and I'm going to describe the entire session in just a second. And we'll be using the chat box. I mentioned this earlier, so please make sure that you have the chat box up and showing, because that's the mechanism we're going to use for the questions and answers. But for right now, we won't be gathering questions immediately. I'm going to, like I said, give you a better description of that in just a second. So my name is Guy Greenaway. I am with the Miistakis Institute. We're a conservation research institute. Conservation Research Institute at the Mount Royal University. And we are co-hosting this webinar, which is really cool, with the Alberta Land Institute. And I'm going to give you guys an introduction to everybody as I describe the entire session here. So before I do that, I just wanted to mention the goals of this webinar, what we're hoping to accomplish, and the reason that we decided to work together to put this webinar. Biodiversity offsets is a topic that kind of ebbs and flows, or some people might say halts and lurches, but it's hard to keep track of where things are. So we wanted to have this webinar, the 101 presentation, but also an expert discussion, give you guys an opportunity to hear that discussion back and forth from some of these experts. And then at the end, we're going to have a question and answer, and I'll describe all of that in just a second. I also want to note for everybody, right at the end, we've got a slide that's going to give you the directions, the URL, the web address to go and get the slide deck and a recording of this webinar, because the webinar is going to be recorded. So all of the materials will be made available to everybody afterwards. So just to describe how we're going to do today, Dave Poulton is going to give an introductory presentation, the Biodiversity Offsets 101. And Dave is a lawyer with a background, a lawyer by background, but has been involved in research and advocacy for environmental protection for over 20 years. He's both the director of the Alberta Land Institute and also the executive director of the Alberta Association for Conservation Offsets, and also consults to governments, industry, and civil society groups on conservation issues. So he has a broad background in the context and the specifics of biodiversity offsets. Now, that presentation is going to take a portion of our time, maybe about 20 to 30 minutes. During his presentation, Shaun Fluker is going to drop in partway and provide some commentary on the use of offsets in the context of species at risk. And Shaun is an associate professor at the University of Law, in the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. He also works there with the faculty's Public Interest Law Clinic, and his research and teaching interests include legal protection for species at risk, an area of expertise for him. After Dave's presentation, we're going to have Dr. Eran Kaplinsky take a few minutes to talk about offsets from an economic perspective. And Eran is the research director of the Alberta Land Institute and is also an associate professor of law at the University of Alberta. And his research areas include property law, municipal law, land use planning, regulation. So again, he brings a broad expertise to his thoughts and to his discussion. So once we've done that, then we're going to bring everybody up, all of the panelists up for a panel discussion. And we'll start by giving it to them for a discussion first. I'm going to ask them to comment on each other's presentations or provide some observations on some of the things they've heard, maybe ask each other questions. And so we'll have the opportunity to have that expert discussion and sort of listen in on that. But then it's your turn, and it's a key part of this webinar is we wanted the opportunity for question and answer. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is not wait with your questions. Like I said, we're using the chat box, and what we're going to do is gather the questions in the chat box, and then I'll be able to put them to our panelists at that point. Now, we have a bit of a challenge because we have over 200 people who are registered for this webinar. So it's quite likely we're going to have quite a number of questions. What I'm going to try and do is gather those questions and maybe curate them a little bit, see if I can group them a little bit and put them to our panelists in a way that they can respond to and in a perhaps more general sense to all of those questions. We'll see how that works. I think it probably work just fine. And if we don't get through, well, guaranteed, we won't get through all of the questions, I'm quite certain. I recognize that we have a limited amount of time, but what we'll do at the end is also post the contact information for all of our speakers. So the email address for all of our speakers will be posted, and you'll be able to contact them directly if you have further questions. We want to make sure that you, no matter what, get an opportunity to have your questions answered. And like I said before, at the end, the very last slide we have is going to have directions for you on where to go to get the slide deck from this webinar and the recording from this webinar so that you can see it afterwards if you want to, provide it to other people if you want to. Okay, so without further ado, what I'm going to do is pass it on to Dave Poulton so that he can provide the first presentation for us.
Thanks very much for that introduction and those preliminaries, Guy, and welcome to all our participants. I appreciate you taking the time. Now, I am going to attempt to share my screen. This is not working the way it did in rehearsal. Okay, here we go. Okay, and make sure we get the right version of this. Okay, so thanks everybody. This is intended to be a very brief and high-level overview of offsetting and some of its main concepts and issues. It will, I hope, at least invite more more questions and probably will stimulate more questions in your minds than it will answer, but it might help to establish at least a framework for thinking about these issues. So my intention here is to briefly talk on our current biodiversity crisis and why there's a need for new tools such as offsetting to address our situation, and get into the concept itself and some of the common issues that are associated with it. Look at where we are on offsetting in both federal and Alberta law and policy, and then end with a brief discussion about what we know about whether offsetting in fact actually works. So with that, let me to the the matter that we are here to be concerned about, because I think it's important in discussing any policy options that you be very clear about what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And here we've got a very grave one indeed. Now, last year we had a report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, under the auspices of the UN, on the current state of biodiversity globally and trends that we've observed over the past years and decades. And that report makes for some very, very grim reading indeed. To summarize it, it says that nature essentially is in deterioration worldwide. 75% of the Earth's land surface has been altered by human activity. 85% of wetlands have been lost. 32 million acres of forest has been lost. 1 million species facing extinction, and invasive species exploding. And those are just a few of the statistics taken from a very long and extensive and extremely well-researched report that indicate that we're in a serious situation. And of course, neither Canada nor Alberta are immune from that. We have our own list of species at risk and endangered wildlife, as every part of the globe does. So there's definitely a need for new tools to address this. And I want to emphasize that offsetting is intended to be a new tool in the toolbox. It is not intended to be a replacement for the important tools that we have, such as protected areas or endangered species legislation. Or mitigation standards. It is intended to give us a new tool that will raise our game and improve our environmental performance. So what is it? Well, I've put on the screen here the definition that was arrived at by a group called the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program. BBOP, as it's known to its friends, was an international collaboration among stakeholders and experts that operated from 2004 to 2018 under the formidable leadership of Carrie Tenkata, for those of you that know her or know her name. And that group of over 80 experts arrived at this definition. Now, it's rather wordy, and it packages several concepts. So let me just summarize by saying that offsetting is the intentional production of environmental gains or goods in order to outweigh the environmental negatives or losses or environmental bads that result from development. And as a result, the intention is to produce no net loss or a net positive impact uh, um, while allowing development to go ahead where appropriate. In the middle of this slide, you'll note that there's several terms which are virtually synonymous, but which are used in different policies or different areas of literature. If you come across any of these, you can assume that we're talking about the same thing unless there's some particularly clear indication otherwise. But there's no need to, it's because it's a relatively new area and there seems to be a need for people to use novel terminology. It can sometimes get confusing. So this graph attempts to show what the purpose is of offsetting and its context in a graphical form. It's intended to be read from left to right, and this sequence is commonly known as the mitigation hierarchy or sometimes the mitigation sequence. On the left, we have a dark bar that stretches down from the 0 baseline down to -10, and that's intended to reflect a development that might proceed without any consideration of environmental mitigation, just development in its pure, raw, and somewhat ruthless form. Well, the first form of mitigation that we expect from any development proponent is that that impacts will be avoided, and that can be done through siting of a project, through seasonal bans that respect seasons of particular sensitivity, or through a very active consideration of whether or not the project should in fact go ahead at all, given its environmental impacts. Once all reasonable measures have been taken to avoid impacts, our next level of expectation, shown on the third bar, is that those impacts which remain will be minimized or mitigated to the fullest extent possible. And that once we have taken all reasonable measures to avoid first and then to mitigate or minimize, we are still likely to be left with some residual environmental loss. And what offsetting brings to the game is the possibility of creating a corresponding gain, probably on another site in a different location, but that will counterweigh the residual loss, such that we end up at no net loss, or as seen in the bar on the extreme right, at a net benefit situation. This graph shows a couple of things. The importance of the mitigation hierarchy is, I think, that offsetting should not be used to in any way lessen the rigor or the effort that is put into avoidance mitigation. It should also not be used as a pretext for approving projects that would not otherwise be seen to be approved. One of the knocks against offsetting is colloquially known as a license to trash. That if we are too liberal in our use of offsetting and not strict enough in these earlier measures, then we may be giving away the store essentially environmentally. Now, what do I mean by environmental gains, and what sort of things might be considered? Well, typically, with respect to habitat, we see habitat restoration. In some cases, that's restoration of habitat that's been previously degraded. In some cases, we see enhancement of habitat by either introduction of new species or correction of some limiting factors. Rarely, but occasionally, there is new habitat constructed where none existed before. And perhaps most controversially, sometimes offsetting is done by way of protection of existing habitat, which is also known as averted loss offsetting. And that raises the question about what we actually gain if we simply increase the security of an existing ecosystem, but don't actually add to its to its ecological function. But sometimes as well, offsetting is done for the purpose of assuring the survival or recovery of a particular species. And in that case, there may be non-habitat measures which might be taken. And just as an example of some of these, I wanted to turn to some interesting experiences that also show the range of offsetting that has been done in different jurisdictions and the prospects which it hold. And I expect that each one of these examples will perhaps raise some doubts or some questions, but I think they're all good grist for the mill. So we have here a northern spotted owl, the bane of the logging industry throughout the Pacific Northwest back over the past few decades in the US, and very much a species of concern in the old growth forests of British Columbia. Well, in British Columbia, for some time, if you were disturbing northern spotted owl habitat, you were required to pay into a fund, and that fund was then used for a captive breeding program for the owl, and also for an eradication program at a competitor owl species. And so the broad theory was that the negative impact on the owl from the habitat disturbance was offset by those particular species specific measures to maintain and enhance the population. A similar note, but with respect to a very different animal in a very different part of the world. This is the saiga antelope that lives on the plains of Central Asia in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. It is really a tragic case in terms of conservation. It is beset by a number of challenges and has suffered a dramatic loss in its population. One of the challenges that it faces is that its habitat is underlain by very good mineral potential. So there has been oil and gas exploration and development on the plains that it resides on. Well, a consortium of English or British petroleum companies designed an offset program in conjunction with the conservation biologists at Oxford University. And to offset any negative impact from their development, they looked at options to sustain the saiga population and settle on a variety of measures, including enhancement and enlargement of the protected areas in the region, and the sponsorship of a new anti-poaching program for the antelope, because they were the subject of poaching, particularly their horns, for the Oriental medicine market, with medicine, of course, in quotes. Closer to home and a little bit more conventionally, we've seen some of the oil sands operators sponsor pilot programs to restore forest in linear to remove linear disturbance in the boreal forest as to see if they can do that as a partial compensation for the impact of some of the oil sands activities. So this is something that is going on worldwide and in taking many, many forms. And I think it behooves all of us that are interested in it to consider the implications of the concept of a whole as a whole, and also the various forms that it might take. Typically, offsetting is carried out through three different delivery mechanisms. The project-specific offsetting is essentially where the proponent is expected to design an offset project to correspond to its particular development project, so that the losses and gains directly correspond to one another on a one-to-one basis. Secondly, in more advanced systems, there's often a banking component where either proponents or in some cases third parties can go ahead, do the offsetting work and produce the environmental gains and hold those in a bank with those credits to then be applied in the future as to future development projects as they may be brought forward. And then finally, somewhat the reverse of banking, in lieu fees and in lieu fee programs refers to a system where proponents, much like the OWL example that I referred to, are expected to pay into a fund, and that fund is then used for later conservation investments and to produce the gains that we're seeking in the offset system. So there's a whole list of issues that arise in developing offset policy and offset projects, and I'm only going to touch on them here. Um, there's certainly much more room for discussion about them. First is that there is a limit to this concept. It's generally recognized that offsetting can be quite risky and that it may not be applicable to those natural resources or species or ecosystems that are particularly rare or vulnerable or irreplaceable. And that there's both a conceptual element to that, as whether or not we have enough research to make those claims with any degree of confidence, but also is often a practical one that it may be theoretically and scientifically possible to replicate particular ecosystem components, but we may not have the resources, we may not have available land, and so on. So that may limit our ability to realistically consider offsetting as an option. There is a whole suite of issues around equivalency, fungibility, and currency. These all refer to the tools that we need in order to draw some valid comparison between the degree of environmental losses and gains, and whether it, it also raises the issue of whether we necessarily want to uh, replace in ecosystem components with identical ones on another site, or whether we want to use the general framework of offsetting to so-called trade up, that is, replace lower value ecosystem components with higher value, more rare, more valuable ones. And there's a lot of interesting issues to be discussed there. Additionality is the requirement that um, in order for a gain to be considered a true gain, it has to be um, uh, produced over and above business as usual, or the environmental outcomes have to be of a nature that would not have come about by any other measure except the offset measure. Timing and duration, often the commencement of offset projects is delayed until after the development project is well underway, sometimes even after it's completed. And as well, the establishing ecosystems through offset measures does not occur overnight. Forest take time to grow. grasslands take time to establish. In many cases, those things may take decades, if not longer. So when do we start awarding credits for action that is taken? Is the action itself enough, or do we wait until we see environmental results? Certainly, no net loss. The goal um, anticipates that the losses and gains will occur in the same time frame. There's also a question at the other end of timing, and not just at the commencement, about how long is an offset intended to last. And the general rule is that it should last at least as long as the impact from the development, the negative impact. And in many cases, that means that it will and should um, last indefinitely in perpetuity. But do we have the legal tools to make sure that that is in fact the case, to provide the adequate protection for the outcomes from the offset project? Overlying this whole area is the question of uncertainty. As I said, that offsetting in I would say virtually all cases has some element of risk of failure, either because of unforeseen elements of the environment, or because of human error, or in the rare cases, um, human fraud, frankly. Um, but how do we take appropriate measures to minimize that risk and to address the risk that remains? One of the most common tools used there is the use of multipliers. That is, that the offset project is larger than the impact project by some multiple. There's also an aspect of social impacts. It's not just abstract or scientific measures of nature that are involved here. There are general, very, very real social benefits from living in and around natural features, as well. There's obviously social benefits from development, and redistributing those on the landscape can cause controversy and tension. And finally, there's the whole question of who oversees this whole project, and make sure that it's living up to its goals and operating in a transparent and scientifically credible manner. So that's a long list, and as I say, every one of them is worthy of extended discussion that we won't have time for today. Um, where are we seeing this internationally? This is becoming more and more the norm of incorporation of offsetting into both project planning and conservation program planning. 2017 report surveyed worldwide and found 99 offset programs, um, and I could almost guarantee that that number would be significantly higher today. The parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity have sponsored research into offsetting. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, adopted a policy on offsetting, supporting it conditionally, leaning heavily along on the mitigation hierarchy. That was in September of 2016, and there's work currently underway to form a thematic group to elaborate on policy guidance there. And in the financial world, the International Financial Corporation, World development that is financed by the ISC, that there be no net loss in natural habitat, and for critical habitat that the project demonstrate net gain. That's a major driver for offsetting projects in the developing world. The Equator Principles are a set of sustainability principles that many of the world's major banks have signed on to. It has similar provisions to IFC PS6, and most of the major Canadian banks are signatories to the Equator Principles. So they should be looking at incorporating offsetting into the planning of the projects that they finance. And I may just say in passing that you may notice through my presentation that I will be using the word should a lot, and that doesn't necessarily mean that these things are actually happening at the in the way or at the level that they should be or have been prescribed to be. Okay, so moving now to Canadian policy, we have several pieces. The most broadly known and one of longest duration is the federal um, fish habitat policy that is um, uh, an operationalization of Section 35.2 of the Fisheries Act that requires a permit if one is going to undertake activity that will result in harmful alteration, disturbance, or destruction of fish habitat. And the federal policy requires that if that is the case, that equivalent fish habitat will be produced on an offset basis. Federal wetlands policy, which applies on federal lands and federally regulated projects. It requires no net loss for any disturbance of wetlands. So that certainly implies and prescribes offsetting. And the Species at Risk Act has provisions under Section 73, similar to the fish habitat provisions, whereby a permit can be applied for um, which would allow the proponent to undertake activity that may interfere with the survival or recovery of a species at risk. And that certainly means or implies that offsetting is on the table. And I'm going to break in just a moment here to allow Shaun Fluker to offer his comments on that, because I know it's an area of his particular concern. But before I'll do that, I'll just close by making reference, not close, but momentarily, to this document, the Operational Framework for the Use of Conservation Allowances, which was published by Environment Canada in 2012 in order to give some principled framework for the application of all of these federal policies, and I believe is currently being updated and revised. But with that, maybe I'll take a break and give you a break from the sound of my voice, and allow Shaun to offer his comments on how and whether offsets apply to species at risk.
Thanks, Dave. Guy, can everybody hear me? It's hard to know sitting in my office here if that's the case.
I can.
Okay, good enough. Thanks, got it. Thanks to the chat box too. Yeah, so I mean, well, frankly, biodiversity offsets are certainly not a panacea for solving the biodiversity crisis. And, you know, I think, unfortunately, they often look really good on paper, but there's a real risk that they're a total failure on the ground. And I think that in particular in relation to species at risk. So yeah, I have some serious reservations about their effectiveness in that context. And Dave's previous slide, where he ran through a number of the limitations or issues in relation to offsets, I think is really illustrated by the species at risk question. So, you know, I've got 4 points I'll make in relation to offsets and species at risk, and then Dave, I'll return the microphone back to you. I mean, I think just about everybody who's here today will agree that, you know, the number one issue facing species at risk around the world, and certainly here in Alberta and in Canada, is the loss of habitat. And so to the extent offsets are going to be used to address that issue, I really think there are some significant issues that have to be dealt with. So the first one is, again, we're talking about with species at risk and offsetting, it's almost always about a project that has a footprint that is going to damage or destroy designated critical habitat. And too often, I think the modifier critical is overlooked. I mean, the idea of critical habitat, as the scientists in the room will know, is that, this is sort of the end of the road for that species. It's often, or by definition, I think, has to be extremely rare, is often very unique, and is very difficult to replicate. That's the whole reason why it's identified as critical habitat. And so again, that raises real problems in relation to fungibility, quantifiability, and currency within the offsetting system. I'm also seeing a bit of an unfortunate trend, I think, where project proponents are really putting habitat enhancements on the table as an offset, but I would suggest that in too many of those instances, those enhancements should probably already be in the recovery plan, and we should already be working on them. So again, to bring that back to the list of issues that Dave went through a minute ago, I think we have some significant additionality issues with offsets, in the sense that true additionality is, in a species at risk context, is probably creating or restoring recovery habitat, and unfortunately I haven't seen very much of that on the ground, but I'd be happy to hear from the audience of examples that maybe I'm not aware of. And again, to just really, I think, reemphasize one of the points that Dave already made, which is to say that the time lag between a project impact and a habitat restoration, if we were even going for the Cadillac here, is hugely problematic. Again, it goes back to the notion that offsetting in the context of species at risk is typically associated with damage to critical habitat. There's frankly no time, or there is no available time to allow for that lag. The whole reason why the habitat is critical is because it simply can't be lost. So again, that particular issue is highly problematic, and likewise on the enforcement and monitoring side. Now, I know a few of the questions in the chat box are really early on here talked about, what's the law or what's the legal framework governing offsets. And again, the devil's in the details with the offsets, and frankly, the absence of a legal framework, or for that matter, even much of a policy framework, is again a real problem in this context of offsets. And in particular, I think maybe even more problematic in a jurisdiction like Alberta, where as many in the room will know, so much decision-making is highly discretionary as it is. So the absence of a legal framework means, there's real questions about the rigor of offsets that are agreed to. There's, little accountability, not a lot of transparency, and enforcement's a real issue. So yeah, I have to say I'm a fairly big cynic when it comes to the use of biodiversity offsets in the species at risk context. And unfortunately, I think species at risk is probably one of the subjects where offsets are going to be used or proposed most frequently. So Dave, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Shaun. I presume that I am back live. Somebody can send me a note if you can't hear me. I'll assume you can. Okay, good, thank you. So yeah, thanks for those comments, Shaun, and I think you've laid some important issues and questions on the table. So I want to move on. I see that we are, my slide is not advancing. There we go. Yes, I see what the time is going by, so I'm going to accelerate my presentation a little bit. This is the recent amendments to our federal impact assessment system through Bill C-69 last year added the term of offsetting into the definition of mitigation measures. I haven't heard any discussion about the significance of that wording change, but it certainly indicates that the concept is being given more profile and prominence. In Alberta, we've had more than 10 years of endorsements of the idea of offsetting in different policy documents. Some of those have been given more life than others, but overall we've seen, I think, a lot of discussion among stakeholders, a lot of discussion between stakeholders and policymakers, but not a lot of action aside from the Alberta wetland policy. Now, I think we're seeing changes to that now. In the UCP platform in the 2019 election, there was a specific mention of a positive mention of offsetting and making greater use of it. And I know that there's work underway within the government of Alberta right now to try and flesh out some policy framework. Alberta isn't alone in that. These other jurisdictions have employed offsetting in one way or another under these various policies. And let me extend my apologies to any of these jurisdictions where I've misrepresented the state of things, or if there's other jurisdictions whose efforts I haven't recognized here. I know, for example, there's been some good thinking being done in the Northwest Territories around developing a policy. As well, the regulators have not been silent on this. As Shaun said, many of these decisions have been based on either wetlands or species at risk. So the particularly active, the National Energy Board over the last 8 or 10 years has issued a whole series of decisions and developed actually quite a sophisticated set of understandings and expectations around offsetting, particularly around caribou habitat. In its more recent incarnation, of course, the National Energy Board is now the Canadian Energy Regulator. There's been some joint review panels with federal and provincial projects considering it. And in 2018, the Alberta Energy Regulator, in kind of a breakthrough decision, required offsetting for caribou habitat in the White Spruce Pipeline decision. And not on this list, but worth noting is also the Tech Frontier Mine, the joint review panel that considered it, made some comments about the gap in policy around offsetting and how it would be very useful to have some policy guidance to guide regulators in that sort of situation. Okay, and the major policy in Alberta that employs offsetting that currently exists is the Alberta Wetland Policy. I won't dwell on this too much in the name of time, but it requires that any developer that disturbs or destroys a wetland either provide what's called restorative replacement, which is to say that the developer undertakes its own offset project to construct or enhance or restore another wetland, or it pay a fee into the government. And in fact, I think just about every, I'm quite confident saying every application that has come forward under the policy has resulted in a fee being paid, and that those monies are being collected within a fund within the provincial government and to be used for wetland replacement. The policy illustrates a couple of notes, a couple of those issues around equivalency and risk mitigation. So the policy employs these 4 criteria of contribution to water quality, hydrology, biodiversity, and human use, combines them with regional scarcity to give each wetland a rating on an A to D basis, which essentially reflects the wetland's value, and then applies this matrix of multiplier ratios to determine how much the replacement must be provided for the loss of a particular wetland. The Alberta Land Stewardship Act has very broad provisions enabling regulations for offsetting. The terminology in the act is extremely, it's broad, so broad that it's actually hard to figure out what is intended by it. It raises such a range of options, but certainly enables the provincial government to promulgate regulations to enable offsetting in a great many ways, and leaves a lot of room for creativity. To date, we haven't got any regulations, despite the fact that the Act is now over 10 years old. But I do know that work is underway within the provincial government. Hopefully within a few weeks, we'll be hearing some news about that. Finally, does any of this work? As Shaun says, that is the ultimate guide. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of empirical review of offset program results overall. One very important one, though, came out last year from Suam Gasson that looked at reports on 32 studies of offsetting where ecological results were reported. And of them found that only 1/4 of offset programs that operate at a landscape level reported that no net loss was achieved. At a program level, only 7 of 12 were reported to be successful, and at the project level, only 17 of 48. The difference between those totals and the 32 studies is that some of the studies covered more than one program or project. The most successful recorded were with respect to wetlands. The least successful was in establishing forest ecosystems, but there was a lot of provisos around that. In particular, these studies relied on reports from the studies themselves, that they assessed whether or not there was no net loss, and they did that not necessarily with consistent criteria or rigor. As well, for example, in the case of the forest ecosystems, there was only 4 studies that were available, and they were all in Australia, and so likely not very representative. But I think we can also appreciate that forest ecosystems have the longest time lag and may therefore be both the hardest to achieve no net loss and also the slowest to achieve it, and so maybe not reported. Overall, though, I think the authors of this work, and I think many others have noted, we really have a dearth of data on the ecological outcomes of offsetting. Often the monitoring that takes place within offset programs is focused merely on compliance, due to our proponents undertaking the actions they say they will, and there's either not any or little follow-up to determine whether or not the ecological results that were planned are actually met, much less that no net loss or net gain is achieved. So definitely room for empirical work here, and of course that ultimately is where we'll get the answer to the question of whether or not offsetting is a wise course to undertake. Just in closing, I wanted to note that in addition to World Biodiversity Day, one of the purposes of this webinar was to mark an event that should have occurred next week in Banff. We at the Alberta Land Institute hold a biennial conference, and this year it was going to focus on biodiversity offsets. We had an outstanding array of speakers with expertise from around the world. But nature intervened in the form of the pandemic and forced us to postpone it. I do want to emphasize that it is only postponed. We are planning on holding it again once it is clear that we can do so safely. And so please stay tuned to the ALI website and our other means of communication, and we'll let you know as soon as possible when that will occur, and we'll have a chance to sit down for 2.5 days and talk about some of the issues that we've raised here this morning. With that, I'm going to close my presentation, and I believe we're going to be turning to Eran Kaplinsky for his comments on some of the economic considerations in offsetting.
Thanks, Dave. I will keep my comments brief. Just as the health of the environment transcends ideology and political camps, it requires us to blur old formal distinctions between public and private governments and markets, and to have the courage, frankly, to experiment with different tools that combine the best of both worlds. It's taken us the better part of 50 years, but I think we're getting better at it. To harness market forces in the service of the environment or any other public objective, governments must do two things. First, they must clarify who has the right to do what, and this is what legal scholars refer to as property rights. And second, governments must establish the rules to enable and facilitate transactions in these entitlements, so that if the right to do something belongs to X, but Y can do it more efficiently, then Y can buy X's right. And these programs are sometimes referred to as market-based instruments, and they have been at the center of some of the Alberta Land Institute's most interesting projects, I think. Broadly speaking, these kinds of programs or markets fall into two categories. One is based on price, and good examples here are carbon taxes and land development levies, which are intended to ensure that a producer or a developer bears all of the costs of their decisions. And the other is based on quantity, and here an example would be transferable development credits. Biodiversity offsets are premised on quantity and specifically the goal of no net loss. No net loss is a political decision and one that is supported by science. And the details of any particular biodiversity offset program, as Shaun points out, must be worked out based on what we know about the species, the physical environment, the economic and political market for development, and various other factors. The main advantage of offsets is that they reward developers who are good at avoiding environmental harm or disturbance, and they also reward suppliers of offsets who are effective at improving biodiversity. So offsets can encourage innovation, which is a foundation of markets at both ends. Dave, in his presentation, highlighted some successful examples, but also conceptual and practical challenges in implementing offset programs. But offsets don't have to be perfect, just better than their political policy alternatives. So if the practical alternative to imperfect offsets is development without any mitigation, which would you take? Thanks.
Okay, thanks to all of our presenters. Now, as Dave noted, our time is a little bit different than what we had anticipated. I'm going to suggest this, if Dave, Eran, and Shaun are okay with this. First of all, I'll just note that all of the information that has been presented today and all of the information that's going to come yet, I think, can be accessed here. So you've got the contact information for all of the speakers, and you've got the addresses, the website addresses for the slides and recording for the webinar that you've been listening to today. And then just to double up on Dave's note about the Land Use 2020 conference focusing on biodiversity offsets, that there's the website for that as well, so that you can hook on there and find out more information and keep track of what's going to happen with that. Now, my suggestion is we've got a handful of questions, but we're also pretty close to time, and I know lots of people are going to have to sign off. But if you guys are okay, perhaps we could take a few more moments and see if we could capture some questions. Dave, Eran, and Shaun, are you guys okay with that?
That's fine for me.
Yeah, all good on me, my end.
Okay, great. So the questions that have been coming in, and you've probably heard that the panelists were able to track those and see those. I'm just going to, like I said, try and group them a little bit, but start at the beginning. One of the questions, and I'll put it to whoever wants to answer. I'll also ask that you guys keep your answers a little bit short, because we do want to try and get the answers to as many questions as possible and wrap this up a little bit. One of the questions was in relation to the mitigation hierarchy. Is there legislation for the mitigation hierarchy?
Yes, well, yes and no. That is, it is from time to time mentioned in legislation. The real problem with it is the challenge. Is that the terms, for example, that you use all reasonable measures to avoid, is very much subject to interpretation uh, when. When it's applied in any particular case. And often there's been some quite serious critiques done that the earlier stages may be skipped over, and there's a lack of evidence, for example, that avoidance is being stringently applied. But yes, the strict answer is yes. In certain pieces of legislation, it's specified, but it's in the application that it often becomes less clear.
Okay, thanks. And any of the others you want to dive in on that?
Shaun here. I mean, you know, Section 73 of the Federal Species at Risk Act, it doesn't really specifically address the mitigation hierarchy, but one subsection in there certainly reads like it, because the first clause talks about avoiding impacts, the second provision in there talks about minimizing impact, and then the third provision, which is where I think the offsetting policy would slot in, talks about not otherwise jeopardizing critical habitat. But you know, I would say that from what I've seen anyways, the approach that most project proponents are taking is offsetting is a alternative to avoidance and mitigation, frankly. So yeah, I think we could use with some stronger rules on the mitigation hierarchy.
So this sort of relates to one of the other questions that came in, which was around the implications for proponents if an offset is deemed to fail, which of course is going to encapsulate all of the responsibility questions, the timing questions, the risk management. But if there is that legislative framework requiring these things, what happens to a proponent if the offset is deemed to fail?
Well, often the development that they're seeking to do is completed before there's any offsetting results to review. So the possibility of withholding a permit or holding up their work is precluded. There is a question about who's liable then for correcting the offset program, and often there'll be a fund provided to a land trust that will undertake that work, or in other cases there'll be some government in theory anyway, guarantee of results that they will come in and make up any shortfall. But again, those plans are not necessarily followed through in a way that inspires confidence.
And I will just add, this is Shaun. Again, I think certainly in Alberta, the current approach would be that the requirement for an offset would be set out in a condition attached to a project license. And so, you know, if that offset failed, then that condition would not be fulfilled. But as Dave pointed out, the time duration there makes enforcement proceedings or any other, it makes enforcement proceedings seem pretty unlikely.
I would jump in and add that failure is going to be built into any policy alternative. So in a city that has regulation that prohibits the cutting down of trees is not going to prevent the cutting down of all trees. And even in the private market, a system of damages for torts in case somebody hits your car doesn't mean that all of the injuries get recovered. It's just a fact of life.
Okay. Eran, you brought up a case of a city, and this relates to a couple of questions that came in too. One, just comments about the applicability of offsets in the municipal context or the municipal level, and sort of related to that was another one asking about how many offset programs are for industrial activity versus the private real estate development. And again, usually those kinds of things happening in a municipal context or a municipal regulatory framework.
Well, let me start with the industry versus residential development question. We simply don't have a lot of data on that. In Alberta, it is the wetlands policy that is our major offset program now, and the number of applications that are permits that are given, and where they are and for what is not readily publicly accessible. It's certainly not reported on in an accessible way. So we can't really determine that in that particular case. Hopefully we'll see better reporting provisions in future offset programs. With respect to municipal programs, yes, particularly under the new Municipal Government Act and the enhanced jurisdiction of the cities, there's a lot of interest in cities doing offsetting. The city of Calgary has done work on different forms of offsetting for several years and is showing some ambition around expanding those. So there's definitely potential there. I don't think we've got time to get into any of the details, but yes, this is certainly applicable at the municipal level.
Great. Anyone else want to throw in on that one? Okay. One of the questions was asking about SARA specifically, but the undertone here is about societal willingness. Like, is a SARA or species at risk related offset, is the challenge the mechanisms of the offset program, or is the challenge on the part of society's willingness to bear the costs of the results of undertaking something like that?
Well, Shaun here. I mean, I think what gets lost in these conversations about offsets and species at risk is that, I mean, the starting point, I think, really needs to be that, you know, by the time a species gets onto the species at risk list, I mean, it's almost at the end of the road as it is. So I have a real problem with the concept of offsets, frankly, when we're dealing with an environmental problem of that kind. So, you know, that's on top of the program logistics, which I think are probably insurmountable in a lot of cases. I mean, I'm obviously a bit of a pessimist on this topic, but yeah, it bothers me, I think, that the idea of there being, you know, trade-offs, or that we can still discuss trade-offs in relation to a listed species, to me is really nonsensical. I think we're better off, if we're going to go down that path, we're better off delisting the species and stop pretending that we're actually going to do something about it. So
I'm somewhat less cynical than Shaun is.
That won't be hard.
I certainly think it's an area where we should tread very cautiously, but I think that there's a reason that different species are listed in different ways under SARA or other legislation. Some probably have some provide us with some leeway for manipulation and exchange without putting them in critical danger. And I'm thinking, without getting into parsing the legislation, the definition of critical habitat that Shaun referred to refers to habitat that is necessary for the survival or recovery of a species. Well, just because it's necessary doesn't necessarily mean it's irreplaceable. There may be, there's many things in our lives which are necessary to our lives, but which we substitute one thing for another. And as I say, I'm certainly not suggesting we take this lightly. I think it should be approached with a high level of caution. But I think there is room for some species in some circumstances to approach it that way.
You know, I think that's maybe possible. It's maybe some of this depends on, you know, how the critical habitat is identified or designated. So, you know, there's certainly a trend to identify that habitat in terms of, you know, thresholds rather than, you know, specific geographic locations. But a lot of critical habitat in Canada is identified very specifically, and for some of those much more threatened species, for example, the West Slope cutthroat trout, which I'm familiar with, I mean, along the eastern slopes, we're probably down to, 20 or 30 intact streams. And so when we get into the business of talking about whether or not we can damage or destroy another one, yeah, I have real problem with that.
Yes, certainly for the most extreme cases, I think that's out of the question.
I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. One of the questions was comments or thoughts on what time frame is required for achieving no net loss.
Well, it really depends on the circumstances. Now, ideally, if no net loss is to be taken on its face, it will occur in the same time frame as the loss itself. But practically that's almost never the case. So then the question becomes, how do you compensate for that temporary loss? Is that done through multipliers, meaning a greater gain in the future, or by taking some temporary measures that kind of shore up the value of that ecosystem or those components in the meantime? But it's often an issue that is neglected.
Anyone else want to throw some thoughts in on that one? Eran, there was a specific question for you as you were talking about economic implications, and a question of whether or not there are references that you can direct people who are more interested in this too. I'm going to suggest if there is, we could drop those on a slide and put them in with the slide deck. But if there isn't, an easy collection for you. Sorry, Eran's telling me that, that he's been muted, trying desperately to get into the conversation. How about now, Eran? Are you in here?
I hope so.
Yep, you are.
Yes, I am very happy to share references, and my contact information is provided. Does that work?
That would be great. And Eran, I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak to if there was things that you were trying to dive in on before. Is there any comments that you wanted to share?
Well, I think one of the comments here is about the political choices that we make as a society, and one of the first things that we have to do before we embark on any program is to have a good and honest and informed public discussion where we give an opportunity to all of the stakeholders to be heard, and after that, we can start designing programs.
Okay. One of the questions that came in was whether or not there are any examples in the grasslands of offset programs.
There certainly have been attempts. One of the Government of Alberta pilot programs focused on the area down around 1-4 and the Medicine Hat area. It kind of foundered before it really took hold, largely for policy reasons, not environmental ones. And I know that there has been some work done in southern Saskatchewan as well on seeing if we can offset for native grassland. It's a difficult ecosystem because those grasses, particularly the fescue grasses, it's very, very difficult to get them to establish. But some work has been done, and there's a lot of interest in exploring what else might be done on those grasslands.
And it's a good question, Shaun here. One of the real problems in this area, and it's not restricted to this area, but the absence of a policy or a legal framework here means that most of these offsets are established on project-based applications, and so unless you follow and study decisions issued on a regular basis by the Alberta Energy Regulator or the Alberta Utilities Commission, or if you can somehow get access to decisions issued by Alberta Environment, it's really hard to track that question, which is really unfortunate because transparency breeds learning, and we're just not there.
Dave, I'm just going to ask you if you could very quickly, for those who don't know, I introduced you as also being the executive director of the Alberta Association of Conservation Offsets. Can you just mention that very briefly? I'm thinking in relation to what Shaun just said about the difficulty of trying to get information about offsets. Is there an opportunity there for people?
Yeah, so yeah, the Alberta Association for Conservation Offsets, AACO or ACO, is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral forum for advancing thinking and policy on offsets, particular focus in Alberta, but not exclusively. Our website is www.aaco.ca, and if you go to that website, I see a lot of people are looking for resources. We do have a resource and links page that has both some of our past webinars, although those recordings are no longer there, and also links to several important publications or other resources worldwide.
Okay, great. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll add the ACO website again onto one of these slides so that when the slide deck gets shared, people will see that website as well in case they didn't grab it down. I'm going to go with, we're now about 15 minutes past time, and I'm conscious that everybody has other things to do, but there's one other group of questions that I just wanted to give people a chance to speak to. There was a question about Indigenous rights and the use of traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge in the context of offsets. Any comments there?
Yes, I certainly do. I mentioned in my issues slide that there are social aspects to offsetting, and this is probably the most important manifestation. First of all, the incorporation of traditional knowledge, the planning of offsetting is often done on scientific knowledge and data collected through the scientific process. It is, I think everybody recognizes that it's increasingly important that we incorporate traditional knowledge into our assessment process in all ways, and that includes taking into account values which may be something other than ecological, the traditional or cultural values that are placed on a landscape have to be taken into account, and those people with a key interest in those, especially Indigenous groups, have to be consulted and involved in the offset process.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think in a lot of cases the offset, it's a proponent-driven process in the sense that it's the project proponent who develops, hires the environmental consultants and does the science work, and that gets vetted by the regulator or whoever the approval authority happens to be. And it isn't necessarily the case that there's space for the Indigenous voice in those processes. And I mean, it goes back to the vexing problems that never seem to go away, which is what's the appropriate level of participation of various stakeholders? When do you invite them into the process? And unfortunately, too often, I think our regulatory system, if it invites enough stakeholders in at all, tends to invite them in far too late in the process to have any meaningful impact into some of these issues. So.
Okay, it's my unfortunate responsibility to be the one to say we're going to have to stop, because there's lots of great comments. I've tried to focus just on the ones that came through as questions, but there was a number of comments as well that it's unfortunately we weren't able to get to. But I want to first of all just say thanks to Dave, Shaun, and Eran for their presentations and their comments and their answers to the questions. I think this has been really good, more than just 101 of the biodiversity offsets. I will again mention that all of this information is going to be available both through the Alberta Land Institute's website and the Miistakis Institute's website, and you can get the slide deck and the recording there. My apologies to everybody who was putting in further questions that we didn't get to all of them, but again, the contact information for each of the speakers is there, and especially if you have something that's specific to one of the speakers, make sure that you get it to directly to them. And Dave, is there anything you want to say just as a final sign off?
No, I just thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us, and I hope you found some value in it. And I would certainly welcome any follow-up notes. Keep those cards and letters coming in, and I'll do my best to respond and provide any further information that I can.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody, and thanks for taking part. And I'll just, on behalf of Miistakis, mention we do our webinars every Monday, and that website has all of our upcoming webinars as well. And hopefully we'll have more opportunities to work in collaboration with the Alberta Land Institute on things. So thanks again very much.